where you're discussing a local restaurant and the discussion revolves around whether their meat is truly hand-cut zabiha or not, halal versus zabiha and so forth, and that's certainly understandable. But sometimes you have to go beyond that. If they're discussing this particular issue and I stop them, as I mentioned earlier, a lot of times we're not really thinking about this, but if you start looking at all the chemicals, especially synthetic chemicals that have been added to our food supply, it's really honestly mind-boggling and honestly kind of scary. He's hungry and thirsty, he calls out to his Lord. He says, Ya Rab, O Lord, O Lord. And yet the Prophet ﷺ says that his food is unlawful. Assalamu alaikum, peace unto everyone. Brothers and sisters, today we're going to be continuing our series regarding the greatest contributions of Islamic medicine to modern health. When I often speak to Muslims about this particular subject, I often find that they don't realize its importance until you really get into it with them. Or just recently they may be slowly starting to realize its importance, but historically it's not really been on their radar. When I often speak to Muslims about the subject of food, typically the discussion revolves around halal and haram, around zabiha and non-zabiha. You know, I'm sure you guys have been through conversations where you're discussing a local restaurant and the discussion revolves around whether their meat is truly hand-cut zabiha or not, halal versus zabiha and so forth, and that's certainly understandable. But sometimes you have to go beyond that. If they're discussing this particular issue and I stop them and I say, well, does this particular restaurant have Tayyib food? Suddenly you get an awkward pause. And they haven't really thought about this particular question. But brothers and sisters, keep in mind that Allah in the Quran very clearly gives us commandments to eat not only what is halal, but also what is tayyib. So this is a very important subject that we're going to be discussing here today. Even when I speak to non-Muslims about this, they may not be aware of the term tayyib, but if you think about it, they are very much interested in the subject of organic food, locally sourced food, or food that is in season, food that is pure and free of preservatives and chemicals. So even in the modern world, you're seeing that non-Muslims are very much interested in this topic, and they are also conveying that it's something that is very important for consumers. So keep in mind, in the Quran itself, Allah Himself has reminded us and commanded us. First of all, in Surah Al-Baqarah, Ya ayyuhan nas, كلوا مما في الأرض حلالا طيبا ولا تتبعوا خطوات الشيطان. O humanity, eat from what is lawful and what is good and pure or tayyib on the earth, and do not follow shaitan's footsteps. Just 4 verses later in Surah Baqarah itself, now it's specifically addressing not just humanity but the believers themselves when it says, يا أيها الذين آمنوا كلوا من طيبات ما رزقناكم وَاشْكُرُوا لِلَّهِ إِن كُنْتُمْ إِيَّاهُ تَعْبُدُونَ. O believers, eat from the good or pure things which Allah has provided for you, and give thanks to Allah if you truly worship Him alone. So brothers and sisters, tayyib is a very comprehensive concept in the Quran and Sunnah in the Islamic tradition. In Arabic, it has a meaning which pertains to many different connotations. In Arabic, tayyib means what is good, what is clean, what is pure, what is wholesome, what is even gentle or excellent or fair, or what is lawful. But most common translators of the Quran will translate it as what is good and pure. So keep in mind, tayyib is describing a standard that is higher or a few steps above halal. It is something that is a higher standard. You know, halal and haram, I've done a completely different video on this particular subject and the merits of that, so you go ahead and check that video out as well. But that relates to what is permissible and what's impermissible. But here we're describing a higher standard. Just to give you a couple examples, let's say you go out to the farm and you do a zabiha, hand-cut slaughter of a chicken, and you are happy, you did your du'as, you're happy that you did so, and you say, wow, I've got some nice, beautiful halal chicken. But then you find out later that it was on a non-Muslim farm and they kept it in a cage for its whole life. They fed it protein feed. They may have given it a growth hormone or other injections. And then suddenly you wonder, was this really tayyib or not? To give you another more mundane example, let's say your kids are wanting to buy some strawberry gummies and you're checking out different brands at the store, and this brand says, wow, this gummy has actual strawberry in it and it's supposed to be healthier. So you look at the ingredients, you get it for your kids, and then afterwards you realize on the ingredients, those strawberries also contain some other ingredients. They may have contained certain artificial flavors, certain artificial colors, It may have high fructose corn syrup. Later you may find that the strawberries that were used in there were sprayed with pesticide or insecticide. So suddenly you start wondering, is this really Tayyib or not? So again, these are things we really have to begin to start pondering. Brothers and sisters, I'm going to provide for you the top 3 reasons why we should be consuming Tayyib and why it should be much more important on our radar. Number 1, eating halal and Tayyib is what is best for our physical health. Keep in mind that, as I mentioned earlier, a lot of times we're not really thinking about this, but if you start looking at all the chemicals, especially synthetic chemicals that have been added to our food supply, it's really honestly mind-boggling and honestly kind of scary. If you look at the chart or the visual aid next to me, you will see that there are a number of different examples of chemicals that have been added to various food products. First of all, there are artificial sweeteners, things like acesulfame K, aspartame, saccharin, sucralose, and so forth. In the artificial color department, there's what we call red dye number 5, there's yellow dye number 5 and 6, there's a blue number 1 and 2. This has been in the news lately. Some of you may have heard how red number 5 was finally banned. It was banned in many countries for many years. The US FDA was kind of slow to ban it, but these are also very harmful ingredients. If you look at the number of different pesticides, herbicides, and insecticides that are used in the food supply or in the food chain, they're mind-boggling. 2 of the most common and most harmful ones are called glyphosate and atrazine. The more common name of glyphosate is Roundup. Some of you may have seen Roundup selling in Walmart or in Lowe's or Home Depot. People often use it to spray chemicals onto the weeds in their yard, but farmers use this as well on their crops. The problem is when you spray it on crop, it also gets into the soil, it gets into finished product. You might know or may not know that there are major lawsuits, class action lawsuits against Monsanto right now, because they're finding conclusively that this Roundup is a carcinogen, it's a hormone disruptor. So again, this is something we have to really be aware of. There are also a whole slew of different preservatives, things like benzoates, sulfates, nitrates, nitrites, oil preservatives like BHA, BHT, things like parabens, sodium benzoate, potassium bromate. These are all major synthetic chemicals being added to our food supply, and this is honestly just the tip of the iceberg. There's actually much more than this. It's a big subject, but I'll summarize by putting a few references below the video that summarize some of the major health risks posed by these chemicals. If you're interested and want to look into it in greater detail, I'll put down the reference also from a book from somebody named Sumitra Arora. She's written a book called The Pesticide Risk Assessment. It's a fantastic book that summarizes a lot of these issues, but basically the research shows that these synthetic chemicals are associated with increased risk for even cancer. They're associated with neurological disorders, even behavioral disorders, which are out of control in kids, digestive problems, respiratory problems, even reproductive problems, skin disorders, and more. So again, brothers and sisters, this is something we definitely have to be much more aware of. When it comes to the subject of genetically modified foods or GMO foods, that's another huge subject. I'm going to be putting a separate video out on that. But the quick summary is that Muslim scholars have generally ruled that it's halal or permissible because a number of studies do show that GMO foods, especially in the short term, can be relatively safe. However, this is an ongoing and transient subject because there are more recent studies where they look at several generations of mice that have been fed GMO food, and they start to see adverse effects down the stream into subsequent generations. So it's not as healthy as some people may think. So this subject is really being looked at again. But from a Tayyib standpoint, everybody can make their own decisions. But for me personally, I try to avoid genetically modified foods as much as possible because for me, it's not really something that I would consider to be Tayyib. So again, this is something we have to be aware of. When it comes to using chemicals and genetically modified products in agriculture, a lot of times I hear the common argument that, oh, these chemicals and processes are needed for higher yields and to improve insect resistance and disease resistance and improves the yields. However, this argument has honestly been challenged by a number of different scientists and environmentalists for many years. It is not that simple. There are healthier, safer alternatives to these chemicals that are out there. There are other safer organic ways to do farming as well. When you factor in the cost to human health and to the environment, brothers and sisters, it's a clear-cut winner that we should be following more organic farming as opposed to the more common modern methods of farming, and we'll get into that in the next point as well. So the second point that I wanted to point out to you, brothers and sisters, is that Tayyib is far better or superior for our environment. The fact is that Allah reminds us in the Quran itself, in Surah Al-Hijr, a very important verse you may not have reflected on before, وَالْأَرْضَ مَدَدْنَاهَا وَأَلْقَيْنَا فِيهَا رَوَاسِيَ وَأَنْبَتْنَا فِيهَا مِنْ كُلِّ شَيْءٍ مَوْزُونٍ. As for the earth, we spread it out and placed upon it firm mountains and caused everything to grow therein in perfect balance. So subhanAllah, Allah is reminding us that there is a perfect balance that exists in all the ecosystems around us, including the ecosystem of our soil. So within the soil, there's a perfect ratio of certain minerals like potassium, like nitrogen, phosphorus, and so forth. There's a perfect balance of certain beneficial microorganisms or probiotics that exist in the soil as well. And all the agricultural scientists know that with the heavy use of these herbicides and insecticides and pesticides over the last several decades, they're having a ripple effect or a domino effect on a number of different things that are adverse for our health. So as a simple example, these soil microbes play a very critical role because they are what allow these nutrients to be taken up by the plants. These soil microbes help to give plants what's called growth hormones. They can even help to suppress harmful pathogens or parasites. They can even increase the resistance of these plants to various stressors. So they're extremely important in the soil. So what's happening, as a simple example, is if I grow a tomato in a modern day soil where that soil has been contaminated with decades worth of chemicals and pesticide and insecticide, then what's happening is that these microbes have been destroyed in such large numbers, kind of like antibiotics and their effects on gut health, that what ends up happening is that tomato that you've just grown in that soil no longer has as many nutrients as it should. It no longer has the flavor that it should. It may not even be as resistant to disease as it should. And so you end up in a vicious cycle where farmers end up spraying it even more to try to compensate for the lack of these organisms and nutrients in the soil. A third very critical benefit, brothers and sisters, that I wanted to share relates to the fact that Tayyib foods are better for our own spiritual health, for our deen, for our Islamic and spiritual health. What is the proof? The Prophet ﷺ has said in a very famous hadith that Inna Allah tayyibun la yaqbalu illa tayyiba. O people, Allah Himself is Tayyib and only accepts what is Tayyib. This is mentioned in Musnad Ahmad bin Hanbal. And if you go and read the full length of the hadith, the Prophet ﷺ goes on to say, he actually mentions two verses from the Quran. The verses, two of them about Tayyib. One of them is Ya ayyuhar rusul kulu min at-tayyibat. And then the second verse he mentions, I've already mentioned at the beginning of this video, which is Ya ayyuhal ladina amanu kulu min tayyibati ma razaqnakum. So he is conveying these verses in the hadith, and then he goes on to say that there is a man that he describes who is traveling far through the desert. He becomes disheveled and dusty, and then he's hungry and thirsty. He calls out to his Lord. He says, Ya Rabb, Ya Rabb, O Lord, O Lord. And yet the Prophet ﷺ says that his food is unlawful, his drink is unlawful, his clothing is unlawful. He is nourished by what is unlawful. So how can his dua be answered? SubhanAllah. That is honestly a scary hadith, because it's something that will really make us ponder and reflect. So brothers and sisters, we have to ask ourselves, is our food halal? Is our drink halal and tayyib? Is our food both halal and tayyib? Is our rizq halal and tayyib? So these are things we have to really dig deep and ask ourselves. These are things we should be pondering. Again, I'm not here to make any fatwa or religious rulings or anything regarding specific ingredients in this video. It's here more just to get us to think about these issues, and hopefully we will be much more mindful as we move forward in picking the types of foods for ourselves as well as for our families and our children. I hope you have all benefited from this video. Subhanakallahumma wa bihamdik, nashhadu an la ilaha illa ant, nastaghfiruka wa natubu ilayk.